Would like a glass of water.
You would.
Good.
I'll take one in case I have a coffee fit.
You'd like.
Sure, thank you. Can I help you?
I think I'm okay.
Oh, okay.
So
We're on.
it's like lights, camera, action. Right?
Lights, camera, action.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that was you, the class.
Huh?
Vacation, the class is on.
Oh, okay. 愿定归地是九定真
这是人的巴朗给萨瓦鲁来巴东尼贝巴德玛耶古巴真巴德玛金吉鲁冷静尼贝德维尼桑迪神都尼格登神谢格尼民生滚度尼波林贝罗金杰梅巴给瓦金吉鲁 Lusa Yawa Chuyi Chukur Shin Yudu Jibi Jiwa Dhammadam Shive Jizu Luda Dhamma Shin Karna Lindre Jishin Ramala Nyembo Nyembo Nyenye Nyembe Zo Tashin Trawa Nyangyam Bongwadam Tezo Tada Drupa Jebala Dagrupa Dantemba Jingila Chebe mingan dunne kungi go yire miron zimbe bunzogi Nimere ne darbe dewala dunya jembo ge war jingilo Nanda zamba jeyi namba yi Jendan jimba yu jembo yi Dembe zawa zozo tabala Juba nyembo jeba jingilo Rani zizo lungwa jishin du Mange jowa kingan den rawa Tunne jowa jowe kyugyewe Janjo senjo jombar jingilo Senzan ge kyang su jin nam zung la Gomba mena janju mi juba Lebar dunne geze domba la Zamba drabo lobar jingilo Lobe yola yinwa shi shi jing yang da dan la zi jin xie ba yi shi ne la dun zun du zhao wei lang yu du gi la ge wa jing gi lo tu mo lam zhan du du yu ba na de pa gun gi zhou yu de zhe de ge san ge wu zhu nu da ba de lan yu du ju wa jing gi lo Jeze Guru Nani Jubeji Namna Damse Domba Zungwala Chama Mimbe Neba Negune Zodam Dode Zungwar Jingila Dene Guden Yimbo Ringiki Denan Jijin Dane Zumbayi Kunshin Neja Jole Miya Wa Dambe Sujin Rubar Jingila San Dumbe Shinyan Dan Zu Shin Drube Jona Shabdin Shin Shinan Nangi Bardu Jibi Zo Nyawara Shiwa Jingi Lapdu Zo Kewa Kundu Yanda Lama Dan Jami Jugi Bella Lanshu Shin Saran Lungi Yanden Rabzo Nim Doje Shangi Gopan Yor No Show Jadan Zogi Janam La Janju Bardu Dani Gazu Jim Gagi Junye Gi Bezunam Gi Jola Benju Sangye Jubar Jo Sangye Jadan Zogi Janam La Janju Bardu Dani Gazu Jim Gagi Junye Gi Bezunam Gi Jola Benju Sangye Jubar Jo Sangye Jada Zogi Janam La Janju Bardu Dani Gazuji Dagi Janyan Gi Besanam Gi Jola Benju Sangye Jubar Saji Bugi Juji Medo Jang Riva Vinci Nyinde Gyamadi Sangye Jinju Migde Uargi Doga Namna Shinla Joga Shogyam Guru Rana Mandala Kam Niryataya.
Okay. I think we reached
verse 21. It's an interesting verse. I kind of thought about it and have some kind of different ways of looking at it. Anyway, let's go through it. So this is according to Geshe-ji's outline. This is part of the main section, which is interpreted as addressing the fact that the nominally pleasurable experiences are not actually pleasurable, but rather they are the abatement of some greater form of discomfort, and then that gives the appearance of being pleasurable, which is this unique position that the middle way school, adheres to, and we've talked about it, so I don't need to address it further at the moment. Anyway, so it says this is the fourth section in this subsection in this main part of the commentary. It says, so it says, Jigdemba Nam, right? This is the kind of lead-in to this verse. It says, Jigdemba Nam means worldly persons. And so worldly persons should be understood here as referring to non-Aryas. And by virtue of being non-Aryas, they're still subject to error. And, there are varying degrees of error that a non-Arya might, be susceptible to. In this case, the error is the person who mistakes what is actually a form of suffering, namely the suffering of change, as a form of genuine pleasure. So then here it says, the worldly person views, and there's an interesting word here, it says Sorwa Simba. For those of you reading the Tibetan, Simba is another, it's a kind of an alternative term for favorable. It's meant here as not to suggest pleasurable. So the Tibetan word for pleasurable is dewa, right? Dewa, or sukha in Sanskrit. So here Simba, normally it could be used as something that's a synonym for pleasurable, but Geshe is using it here to suggest, something that is relatively favorable in comparison to something else. So those more favorable sensations, which are actually only the relief of something painful. Dumyal Chirchava means something that is done to, replace some difficult, experience. So it's one of the examples is, so it's you're carrying a heavy load on one of your shoulders, and that shoulder is starting to hurt. So what do? You shift it to another shoulder because the other shoulder doesn't hurt at the moment, and so that's a case of, another experience which is not going to be essentially different from the painful one that you're having, but in the beginning at least, it's not going to hurt as much as the other shoulder's pain is, generating, because you've been trying to load for a longer period of time. So that is a classic example of the middle way scholars' view that the suffering of change is not actually a kind of pleasant experience per se, but it's just some sort of, lesser form of discomfort. So then it says that the worldly person mistakenly regards those kinds of, relief of some more extreme form of discomfort as an actual form of pleasant experience. So Dewarang Zemba is this main view that there is some kind of experience that we can identify as being pleasurable that is essentially different from those experiences that we call painful, and that they are a different class of experience. So the Madhyamikans say, no, they're not a different class of experience. They're just sort of on the lower end of the spectrum of painful experiences, and therefore they seem to be, pleasant in the fact that what they actually are is just less painful. So anyway, this is the description of how this verse is being introduced. And so here, I like the way Chandakirti introduces the verse Chandakirti rather than Gesapir. He introduces them in such a way that he refers to the kind of experience that is presumably being described in the verse as indicative of the fact that there really is pleasure. Because if experiences such as these were not pleasurable, people wouldn't seek them. In other words, they have to be something about them that people find attractive, and by attractiveness means pleasurable. Otherwise, why would people, pursue them? So he says, there is in fact a form of pleasurable experience, which is the abatement of pain. For the non-Madhurikanists, an actual form of pleasure. He says, if it were not a form of pleasure, if it were not genuinely something that was actually pleasurable, people wouldn't do it. People would not take the action of correcting some more painful experience in order to lessen that pain and, be able to, experience something that, by being favorable, is understood as a form of pleasure. So that's Chandakirti saying the abatement of pain is not a lesser suffering. It's actually some kind of, some people would view it as actually some kind of pleasurable experience. Otherwise, why would anybody pursue it, right? This is if it weren't pleasurable, people wouldn't try to experience those kinds of pleasures. So what's interesting is that each of the verses in their own way, not all of them, but these series of verses that are being described as illustrating how this is not actually a form of pleasure, but is really a form of suffering. It's interesting the way Chandakirti introduces them in his commentary. Anyway, so having said that, the verse is as follows. So the verse, actually, the wording is pretty easy. I don't think that the meaning is quite that self-evident. He says, the first half of the verse is a simile. It says, just as someone might be pleased upon vomiting into a golden bowl or vessel, right? Similarly, the correcting or the reduction of pain is considered to be a form of pleasure, right? So the reduction of pain is considered to be a form of pleasure means it's not actually a form of pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. And so this verse is definitely indicative of the Madhyamika position that the correcting of pain is not a genuine form of pleasure, even though some people kind of view it that way, right? And and several of the previous verses were illustrative of that. So, for instance, the idea of getting on a carriage instead of having to walk, that's not really painful. I'm sorry, that's not really pleasurable, even though it might seem to in the beginning. And then they use different arguments. They say, if it weren't suffering at the beginning, it would not increase and then become more evidently something unpleasant at a later time. So that point was made in the previous verse. This verse is sort of more generic, saying that all of those are just examples of what people do to alleviate some kind of greater discomfort. Now, the interesting thing is, to me in this verse is, how do you interpret this simile? Like, what does it mean for someone to be pleased about the fact that he or she is vomiting into a golden vessel? So, I mean, part of the idea is that, well, the golden vessel is something precious, right? And so the fact that you have a golden vessel and that's what you're vomiting into, it says, oh, how lucky I am that I get to vomit into something so valuable rather than just an ordinary, clay pot. And that's kind of the line that Chandrakirti takes. He says exactly that. The verse doesn't directly, set up the contrast between vomiting into a golden vessel versus vomiting into a clay pot. But it's not doesn't need to be that much of a stretch to interpret the verses suggesting it. Anyway, let's see what let's see how let's see. So Gesav's commentary on these verses is pretty much following what Chandrakirti says. So let's just read that first. He says,
I'm sorry, Art, I'm looking at the class 14, the
Yeah.
Karchana Raja Sutta. Is that what you're looking for?
no, that's a handout.
Oh, I'm sorry, which book are you looking for?
Well, this is the yogis of the, yes.
Which book? Sorry, which page? I'm sorry.
You want the, so we're on page 92 in the English translation. So he says, if you claim that the alleviation of suffering or the correction or doing something to relieve suffering is actually a form of pleasure, right? Then this verse is an answer to that. And of course, in this verse there is that actual line. He says the correcting or the alleviating of pain is mistakenly considered to be pleasure, in the same way that someone foolishly, takes pleasure in the fact that he or she is vomiting into a golden vessel. So, but the idea of that simile is, how does that really convey that? It's what the commentaries, these two commentaries are pretty much in agreement. It says some person, and here both of the commentaries say a wealthy person, right? A wealthy person. So a poor person is not going to have a golden pot, right? So a wealthy person is going to be the person who owns a golden pot, and therefore, if one has to purge their whatever this this bad stomach problem by vomiting into it to alleviate that pain, then somehow the person would take pleasure in the fact that he or she has the opportunity to do so into a golden vessel, right? I mean, you can imagine somebody thinking, how lucky I am that I can puke into a gold pot rather than just an ordinary one. But obviously that's a kind of a, what do I say? Anybody that does that would be considered to be kind of ridiculous, right? So it says, Jemo. So in the commentary it says the reason that person who does it was that he or she compares himself to a Jambo means a servant or someone who is in lower social standing. Who, if that person had to vomit, they'd be lucky if they found a clay pot. So it's a sign, means an earthen pot. So it says the only way the person might, conceive of feeling some kind of satisfaction at, vomiting into a golden pot is that, there are other people and they don't have the opportunity to vomit into a golden pot. They have to vomit into an earthen pot. So, how lucky am I?
Excuse me, how could you be thinking that if you're vomiting?
Yeah, I know. So the point is that it's a foolish idea. It's a foolish idea. You'd have to be pretty dumb to think that. But then the contrast is you're also mistaken or erring to think that the alleviation of discomfort is actually a real form of pleasure. That's the connection. That's the parallel. that both of those are mistaken and foolish ideas from the point of view of an Arya. An Arya recognizes that it's only a lessening of some greater form of pain. So that part of it is you can see the parallel. Yeah, so and it says, I lost my text. It says, in fact, there's no difference, right? So the fact that you're vomiting into a golden vessel versus vomiting into an earthen vessel is neither of them are pleasurable, right? Vomiting is vomiting, and it's unpleasant in either case. So the person then is foolishly viewing the fact that one can vomit into a golden vessel as just sort of an indication of, well, look at my higher standing in life that I have. And so it says like that, then a person could similarly, and in fact it's very much the case that people view samsaric pleasures as something that's desirable when then from the Buddhist point of view they are a form of suffering, namely the suffering of change. And in this case, that the interpretation of what the suffering of change is has this unique Madhyamika interpretation to it, which is to say physical pleasures in particular are only and they are nothing more than the alleviation of some other more intense form of discomfort.
Reminds me of a hot dog contest.
Yeah, right. So it says, so here he says that situation in which the discomfort or the unpleasantness is really only a weaker form. Right? Mm-hmm. So it says when that more intense form of suffering has been alleviated, then that alleviation has some favorable aspect to it, and that's all it is. It's not an actual form of a different type of experience that we call pleasurable. So he says, Torah Simba. So here again, Geshe is using this word that's meant to say it's not really dewa. It's just a kind of temporary favorable quality that's not actually some kind of pleasant feeling. So dewa sumne dewa nyam de semba chewa iba dewa rang semba mendo. So the interpretation is just drawing a parallel between the similar mistaken or erring or foolish idea that vomiting into some something that an expensive object is somehow better than vomiting into something that is more ordinary. I think there are one way. I think the golden pot is a first of all, it's a simile, so it's not meant to be taken literally. It's not meant to be saying, oh, all those people that are out there that are purging themselves are enjoying the fact that they're purging themselves into some kind of expensive object. I don't think that's the meaning of the word. That's not the actual sense that to take away from it. It's a simile. So how do we interpret that simile? So one way is that I believe that the idea of a golden vessel is a metaphor for a human rebirth, right? That a golden vessel is something valuable, and that a human rebirth is an important object to have, and here's the kicker. Okay, so the idea that is that ordinary beings waste their lives in pursuit of ordinary pleasures that have no inherent value to them. That's what they think about. How can I maximize my ordinary pleasures? What am I going to do today to make myself as comfortable as possible and forget about anything else, especially forget about the fact that I could die today or I could be reborn in the hells and so on. So I think that the idea of vomiting is a symbol for pursuing ordinary pleasures. So pursuing ordinary pleasures is like vomiting. Is like misusing a golden pot, right? And then sort of taking delight. Oh, I'm getting something out of my my life by pursuing these ordinary pleasures. I think that's a little bit of a more refined way of thinking about the symbol, and I kind of think that that maybe Aryadeva is pointing at something like that, which is a little more subtle than just taking it at face value from the symbol, right? Another way, if you want to take the way in which the Chandrakirti in particular compares the person who can afford a golden vessel, meaning a person who's more wealthy, right? Meaning a person who has not only has a human life, but has a human life that is endowed with prosperity, right? As opposed to a person of lower standing who doesn't have the same prosperity. So the person who is of higher standing, who has prosperity, has the luxury, right, of the wealth that will allow him or her to pursue ordinary pleasures, which the lowly, worker, he's lucky if he or she can, get a job just to, put food on the table. And their life is at a much more, basic level. And so they don't really have the opportunity to go, well, let's go clubbing, or, let's go, have a vacation, go to Tuscany or somewhere and, enjoy my life. So I think that there's this idea of like a person who is, I'm taking the simile to a little bit of a different direction. I'm saying that the person who is at a high station in life, right, can be, that the wealth that a person has that enjoys, that can be a form of self-deception, a form of leading oneself down a path to ruin. And we have these, there are TV shows about, people who win the lottery, and what do with all that money is they make their lives miserable. Well, that's kind of a metaphor or a simile for what this is saying, is that wealth gives you the opportunity to seek ordinary pleasures, but those ordinary pleasures are not real pleasures. So it's like delighting at the fact, oh, look what a great life I have, when actually your great life, the wealth that gives joy and that allows you to pursue ordinary pleasures, is really, from the spiritual point of view, like vomiting into a golden vessel, right? Now that's a second point, right? From the original one. So anyway, I think that the simile is pretty subtle and requires some kind of reflection. So like what Karen said, like, well, who would ever think that, right? Who would ever think vomiting into a golden vessel is really pleasurable? Well, that's not the point of the verse, I don't think, at all. I think the point of the verse is that simile is meant to, describe a ordinary worldly person's pursuit of ordinary pleasures, and that is a flawed way of looking at life. I think that's really the message, and that the second half of the verse is saying, well, why do people do that? It's because they don't understand that those ordinary pleasures are not really pleasures. They think they are, but they're not. They're actually nothing more than the alleviation of what, if you didn't pursue them, would be something less desirable or more uncomfortable. And that's a kind of a more, what should I say, spiritual, view. Anyway, so that's my take on the verse. Now, there's some discussion here, which in Geshe-'s text we ought to look at, because it's very philosophical, and it's kind of a distillation of a lot of important points that are part of the, especially the Prasangika view. Not only the middle way view, but the Prasangika middle way view. So I'm going to kind of gloss over this first part, because this is one that probably is familiar to you, and it's another way of interpreting this idea of the suffering of change from the point of view of the middle way school's interpretation of suffering of change as just replacing a lesser discomfort for a greater discomfort, and then that lesser discomfort, as time goes on, grows, and that's what the suffering of change is. It's sort of the intensification of the lesser pain, then becomes something which is at some point becomes undesirable, and that's what the suffering of change means. That seeming pleasures become evident as unpleasant experiences as with passage of time. So it says, for example, I'll just rather than read it word for word, I'll just kind of give you what it says. So it says, when you are this is appropriate for today, when you are when you're tormented by the heat of the sun on a hot day, right? And of course, India is a hot climate. Then what do? Well, to kind of seek, to alleviate that discomfort, you go into the shade, right? So this is a jimala dukbetsemi. So when you go into the shade, then what happens is immediately the relief from that, the intense burning of the sun's rays becomes lesser, and so you're free from that. Then that is kind of correcting or alleviating or replacing that discomfort, and then being in the shade for the time being seems like it's pleasant. So that's the idea of the Torah Simba. Seems pleasant. Okay, that's the emphasis on the seeming nature of it. He says, however, as soon as that suffering, that the intensity of that suffering of heat, right, has been replaced, yelma tak means as soon as that disappears, right, what actually happens is then the discomfort of being in the shade becomes too cool. And as you stay in the cool, like if you stay in an air-conditioned room, especially if the air conditioner is set really high, at some point, you're going to start feeling uncomfortable from the cold, right? So it says, so you get into the shade, and the comfort that the shade gives you initially is, pleasant, but it's actually, you're replacing the heat with the cold, and then over time, you're going to say, oh, now the shade is going to become unpleasant. So here, this is a very nice phrase. He says, so he's saying there is no such thing as a feeling in which there is no discomfort whatsoever present. Means no kind of unpleasantness to any degree. There is no such feeling. So any kind of samsaric feeling it has some level of unpleasantness that reminds me of something funny. There's a notion of it's like the princess and the pea, right? You can become addicted to trying to make yourself as comfortable all the time. But the fact of the matter is that if you have the means to create the most comfortable kind of circumstance for you possible, the nature of the human being is you'll always find something about even that most pleasant, situation which is uncomfortable, right? No matter how soft. Oh, it's like I remember someone said they went to a restaurant. It's funny. They went to a restaurant and they ordered chocolate cake, and so they ate the chocolate cake, and for some reason they decided they didn't like the chocolate cake, right? And so when people go to a restaurant, some people will call the waitress and say, "I don't like this, take it back." And so this person says to the waitress, just it's not what I wanted, it's not what I like. So the waitress says, "Well, what's wrong with it?" And the person says, "It's too chocolate." Right? So it's like you can have too much pleasantness, and that too much pleasantness will sort of what is it? It will make you become too sensitive, and when you become too sensitive, then the slightest thing is going to make you uncomfortable. So saying like that that samsara is like that. You can't escape the fact that what ultimately there's some degree of unpleasantness no matter what the experience is. Okay, so that's enough of a digression. So he says, "Jiktembe tsorwa dungela ni deshi tsorwa dedu." So by contrast, he says. Now we're getting into the philosophical element of it. I'm sorry. One line down says, "Jiktembe tsorwa dungel," right? On the other hand, what the worldly person considers to be painful, right? That's jiktemba, means worldly person, non-arya, unenlightened person. What they experience as pleasurable sensations, right? Tsorwa dungel, there's deshi tsorwa dewa shukchungu tamyang gobamin. So it's saying, in order to experience an unpleasant sensation, you don't have to reverse. You don't have to sort of take away something pleasant in order to be presented with something unpleasant. On the other hand, in order to experience something pleasant, what the Madhvichan is saying, all that really is taking away some more extreme form of unpleasantness, and that's the only way that you can say to yourself, "I'm experiencing something pleasurable." So that's saying unpleasant things that the ordinary person considers unpleasant are fundamentally different from those experiences that the ordinary person considers pleasant. So in order to have an ordinary pleasant experience, especially a physical one, you have to be replacing something more unpleasant, and then that gives you the opportunity to think you're experiencing something pleasurable. But painful sensations, that's not the case. It's not, you don't have to sort of somehow extract something attractive from a pleasant sensation in order to experience unpleasantness. So therefore, unpleasant sensations are fundamentally different in kind from those ordinary experiences that we call pleasurable. So says "Dungela deshi tsora dewa shukchungu tamyang grava min." So for unpleasant sensations, you don't have to somehow have some pleasantness sort of recede or disappear in order for pain to become manifest. So therefore, now here we're getting into the philosophical part of it. For an ordinary person, dungel rangzemba. Now here's using the word rangzemba. So rangzemba is normally rangzen means having the essential quality of being painful, right? So then dungel rangzemba means an unpleasant experience, which is which has the in a conventional sense the essential quality of being unpleasant. That's Duneran Zemba.
Mhm.
On the other hand, there's no such thing as a pleasant experience, which is Dewaran Zemba. You cannot find anything about pleasant experiences which represents the essentially different kind of experience or qualitative experience that we would identify as pleasant. So saying, Dungeran Zemba Ye, Dewaran Zemba Me. Okay, so there is such a thing conventionally as pain that it has that quality. There's no such thing as pleasant sensations which have some essential quality of pleasantness to them. That's a philosophical statement. Now, that's only the Madhyamikas who say that, because remember, that's the thing that Vasubandhu took issue with, right? So he says, okay, so this is the essence of it. Now, at this point, we get into discussion of relative truth versus ultimate truth. So, sarvas, feelings, are a form of relative truth entity, right? They appear to have some kind of essential quality to them. That's a false appearance, and therefore their ultimate nature is that they're empty of that, and that's their ultimate truth nature, right?
Mhm.
So now here he's saying, Deorang Zemba Me, Dunerang Zemba Yer, right? There is some kind of essential quality that is unpleasantness. There isn't any essential quality that is pleasantness, represents pleasantness. He says that, right? Now, here, this is interesting. Now, this is something I'm not going to be able to resolve, but I'm going to address it, okay? So now he says, Tanyedu Torodawameche Kelandu Mirumte. This is Getzab just saying. And this is something that I'm going to put out there for you for your consideration, and I don't have the answer to it. Okay, so Tanyedo means conventional. Tanye is the word. The Sanskrit word is Vyavahara. Vyavahara refers to the things of ordinary experience, the things that. So sometimes Tanye, the word Tanye means a term, literally, in Tibetan. So Vyavahara can mean a conventional term. But the word in Sanskrit, at least, is its source, its kind of its origin is that it refers to the nature of ordinary life. So, for instance, trade, right? The law, right? Agriculture. Those endeavors, those lifestyles, those ways of living your life, they have their own sort of conventions to them. They have their own sort of terminology, and they have their own sort of elements that are, important that you have to know in order to pursue those livelihoods effectively. So that's what the word Vyavahara refers to. It's kind of the aspect of ordinary experience that we use to, talk about it, and in a way that sort of like you want to be able to live your life effectively or successfully. So you need to know this. These are the kind of the practical things that you need to know in order to navigate that kind of activity. So that's really what conventions, where the word Vyavahara comes from. And in a philosophical sense, that's what conventional truth is about, because it's talking about ordinary experience and how we define ordinary experience and how we have observation is really kind of the main test for ordinary experience. It's like, what do we see? What do we see in our ordinary experience that we need to remember? We need to know that represents the regularity. That if we follow that principle, well, we can confidently, pursue that kind of thing. And on the other hand, if we see something that if we do a different kind of behavior, it's going to, cause problems for us. So it's that level of observation that represents the world of conventional reality. So here he's saying conventionally, using the term in that sense, to say there's no such thing as pleasurable experience, he says, we should not adopt that, belief. That means literally means it's not correct to take that position. We can't take the position there's no such thing as a pleasurable experience conventionally, right?
Correct.
Well, isn't that what the Madhyamikans are saying? In fact, when they say the suffering of change, which refers to so-called pleasurable experiences, are not actually pleasurable experiences. They're actually less intense forms of unpleasantness, right? And if all they are is less intense forms of unpleasantness, then actually they're a form of unpleasantness. There's nothing about them that's pleasurable. If there's nothing about them that's actually pleasurable, then how can we say conventionally there is such a thing as pleasant experiences? Well, Gesab is making a claim here that it's philosophically untenable to say there's no such thing as a pleasurable experience. So what does he mean by saying that? That's I think that's kind of food for thought, shall we say. I don't want to get into, I don't want to try to take it apart here because I'm not sure that I know correctly the answer to it. He says the reason you can't hold that position or take that position is Gurnemtsugurechiro. Gurnemtsugurechiro means that would be a form of discrediting relative truth. So there's Jondok. There's two kinds of false ideas. One is that you wrongly attribute something like an essential nature to things that they don't have. That's Jondok. That's superimposing something on the object that it doesn't actually have. Urindeb is the opposite of that. Urindeb is denying something about the object that it does possess. So he's saying if you deny that there's any such thing as a pleasant experience, then you are in fact violating something that relates to relative truth. That's what he says. Okay, having said that, here is one of the handouts. Okay, so you've got your handout. So this is something that I quote in if you're interested. It's in the book Inner Science. It's in the section on the suffering of change. And let's see, I'll find the page for you. So if you want to look it up, let's see. So, suffering of change, and this particular point is let's see. Okay, page 118. This quotation is from Chandrakirti, no less, right? Chandrakirti, don't forget, he is the champion of the Prasangika view. And this passage is from his commentary on Nagarjuna's 60 verses of reason. I think this is in relation to verse 7. Anyway, so here's, do you find it?
Yeah, I have.
Mikpa means, mikpa usually means an object, right? The word mikpa can be a verb, or it can be the object of the verb. So as a verb, it means that thing which rests upon or takes hold of an object. That's as a verb. So grasping something. Then the thing that's grasped is the object. So the thing that's grasped in this case is the relative truth object. The object that has the appearance of being real. And then generally to grasp it means to perceive it at one level, and typically it also means to believe that it actually is real. But anyway, he says, so when one has a perception, right? Those perceptions, meaning the objects, are of two types. Okay? Chinchilok and chinchimalok. Chinchilok means erring ones, erring perception, and chinchimalokpa means unerring perception. And this is why this is the very famous description of four kind of erring beliefs. Four kind of erring beliefs are to believe what is impermanent, to mistakenly believe it as persisting through time, to believe what is actually a form of suffering, to mistakenly believe it as a form of pleasantness, right? Or pleasant existence or pleasant experience, right? So it's saying there are two kinds of perceptions: erring perceptions, unerring perceptions. So the unerring perception is to perceive suffering as suffering. The erring perception is to perceive suffering as something pleasant, right? So he says, "Dela chinchi lok ni," he says. So what are erring perceptions? Dewa lasok batzim. So the grasping of something as being pleasant, that's an erring perception. So that's kind of saying the idea that there is something that represents a pleasant object, that object is a mistaken thing. There's no such thing as a pleasurable object. Okay? He says, now look at this. Gunzok tuyan. He says, even conventionally, they dangmidu means to that nature, the nature of being pleasant. Mobo namar minebechiro. The object does not actually exist in that way. So, erring perceptions are the apprehension of pleasure and the like, because entities do not possess such a nature even conventionally. Now there, Jadakirti seems to be saying there's no such thing as pleasant experience even conventionally. That seems to be at odds with what Gesabje just said, right? Okay, so then he says, the unerring perception is the perception of suffering and the like. So perception of suffering, perception of impermanence, the perception of unattractiveness, and the perception of selflessness. That we perceive our five skandhas as existing in the absence of any real subjective person. Then that is a correct perception conventionally, right? When we perceive our five skandhas that way, right? So it says, why? Because those objects do possess that nature convention. Now that's a big subject, because now we're talking about conventional truth versus we're introducing the notion of the two truths, and in particular we're talking about how do we distinguish false conventional truths from valid conventional truths, right? So that's the subject. So it's like the idea. So it's the idea of causality, right? The idea of causality, like a seed is able to produce a sprout, right? That's a valid form of conventional truth. Okay? But the idea that a rock could produce a sprout, okay? That idea, you can have that perception, but it would be an erring perception, right? So that doesn't correspond to what we observe in ordinary experience. So the second idea is conventionally false. Right? I'm not delving very deeply into that subject, but the subject is basically yang dakpe kunzok, lokpe kunzok, right? So another example is the example of seeing double. You know,
Yeah.
when you see double, it's an actual perception. You do see double. It looks like you see two things, but there aren't two things.
Mm.
So that's a conventional experience, but a false convention.
Mm.
As opposed to when you see that there's only one object, which is, from a conventional point of view, a valid conventional experience, even though there's no self-existent single thing. So anyway, the purpose of bringing this quote is that it seems to be that Gyatso is saying something which conceivably is at odds with what Chandrakirti himself says about the nature of pleasure, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we were going to say, well, what about the 5 skandhas? Okay, there's 5 skandhas. Among the 5 skandhas, the second skandha is the skandha of feeling. So how many different kinds of feelings are there? Do we want to say 1? There are only unpleasant feelings, or there's the only kind of feeling is the suffering, and that those things that we call pleasant feelings or those things that we call neutral feelings are not qualitatively in any sense neutral or pleasant. That's kind of the issue.
But I think it's a matter of perspective, because conventionally you have to include all samsaric beings, right? And if you're going to talk to all samsaric beings, everyone's going to say that Ben and Jerry's ice cream on today on the sidewalk would be really nice, right?
Yeah.
And it's pleasurable.
Right.
Everybody's going to say that.
Yeah.
There's going to be few people who would say, "Oh, you're wrong."
No,
But Arya talking to Arya, that's a different story, right?
Well, how about Arya talking to non-Arya? How about Arya saying to that person who's having the Ben and Jerry's ice cream, "You think that's pleasurable, but actually it's not."
For the person that's uninterested in hearing about it, you aren't going to get through to
You're not
it.
gonna
And
get-
so you're not
Well,
going to,
that's
debating, you
possible.
need to talk the same language that people can
Okay.
understand,
Okay.
right?
Well, that's
So-
another issue. And the point is whether it's true or not. Is it true to say that it's, if there is a kind of pleasurable experience? I'm not advocating
Yeah.
that it isn't true. And there's also another very famous statement which is attributed to the Buddha. And he says, "I do not argue with the world. The world argues with me."
Right.
And so, he in other words, the purpose of the Buddha's teaching is to correct mistaken ideas that people have. And, the Buddha only will make those statements, presumably, if the person is, open to hearing them.
That's right.
Otherwise, he's not going to go, he's not Don Quixote. He's not going to go tilting when. So anyway, it's an interesting, the point that I'm trying to make is that Gyatso is making the statement that, there's no such thing as Dewa Rang Zemba, right? He's taking the Madhumika Prasanga point of view. There's Dungerang Zemba. There's a form of feeling which is has the essential quality of pain, but there's no such quality to what we call pleasurable experiences that we can identify as being its pleasant essential quality, and yet we don't want to say there's no such thing as pleasant experience.
Right.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
That's what Gyatso said. Now here, what my point is, Chandrakirti seems to be saying, hey, you may think there's pleasant experiences, but there aren't any. It's a mistake. It's a chinchilo. It's an erring perception. It's an erring perception. It means it's mistaken. So I'll leave that to you to deal with. If you're well, I don't want to get into those kind of things, but the Gelugpa scholar is going to say to me, he's going to say, "You're questioning Gyatso? What's the matter with you?" So anyway, I lost that page. Okay, there's that one. Yeah. Okay. So I'll leave you with that, and then he says, Okay, he goes on. He says here, for example, this is his explanation of the difference between, he says, now here's how he distinguishes. He distinguishes, okay, this is his solution. And I got to say, Jesabje was a pretty skilled logician, right? So here he says, if you compare the color blue and the color yellow, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that the thing which is blue in comparison to the thing which is yellow is going to lose the characteristic of appearing blue. Colors are colors. It's not going to holding it up next to another color. It's not going to affect how you see that first color, right? He says, there's never going to be a case where by holding something of a different color next to something, that first thing is going to look a different color. On the other hand, there are other things, there are other qualities, such as the quality of being long versus the quality of being short. Those are completely relative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that thing which we look at and which strikes us as being long strikes us that way only because in comparison to all other objects that we normally perceive, it seems long. But if you come along and take something else that is really long, then that thing is not going to look long anymore. It's going to look short, or you can think of it as short. So long and short are relative. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying that's the way you distinguish between unpleasant feelings and pleasant feelings.
That's interesting.
So,
Exactly.
but we do say that short is something that exists. It's not a meaningless word, right?
Yeah, that's good.
So that's his
good.
analysis.
That's good. I like that.
Okay?
That's
You like
a good
it?
one.
Okay.
That's a good one.
So I don't know. I mean, anyway. So he says, and then he makes a final point. He says, "Taki kati chiki ranzin tang dur gormichao." So then this is a completely different, point. So we have the word rangzen. Rangzen is the Tibetan for swalakshana. Lakshana means a mark, and swalakshana means its own mark, right? So the word swalakshana usually means the essential attribute of something.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about this thing that leads us to call it that, right? So what is it about an unpleasant experience that leads us to say it's unpleasant, right? There's something about it that is qualitatively painful, and so that's why we say it's a form of unpleasantness. He says, so then that word swalakshana, right, or essential attribute, is used in Madhyamika philosophy to say, even though maybe conventionally we say things have essential attributes, things do not have an essential nature, which is which defines their very essence, their objective, real, essential nature, right? So that is gaccha. From the point of view, rikpe gaccha means what we're trying to refute about all conventional entities is that they have any essential nature that identifies their independent mode of being, right? So he says that's a taki gache chur. Gache chur means the thing to be refuted is debar druba. If a thing is truly existent, then one of the ways in which we could determine that is if we could identify some essential attribute which it has, and it has in a real independent way that identifies it as its essential nature. So that, from one point of view, doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that conventionally we don't want to say that painful experiences have some defining attribute, which is why we say that they are painful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we say, "Dungerang zemba yer, dewarang zemba me," right? And then he gives this nice example of saying, like, blue and yellow, the difference between blue and yellow is like the difference between being punched in the nose and being punched in the gut. Both of them are painful, and both of them are essentially unpleasant, right?
Mhm.
And there's no lessening of pleasantness in order for them to appear unpleasant.
Mhm.
On the other hand, pleasant experiences are fundamentally different in that there's nothing about them that can be identified as their essential pleasantness. From the Madhyamika point of view, their pleasantness physical pleasantness consists only in the sense that they are the relief from some greater unpleasantness. And so for a short period of time, they have that quality of seeming to be, enjoyable. Okay? So that's kind of what we're talking about philosophically here. He introduces this point. Let's see. Then here is I just want to throw this in. I want to get through the whole chapter here today. But what's the simile? So the simile is, there's no other simile here, I think, he mentions it, but he doesn't explain it. At the very end, he says, Perna tapang ki numbala deorsemadan drao. Okay? So it says, tapang. Tapang is, pang means to abandon, right? Tapang. Ta means horse. Pang means what is abandoned by a horse. So what's abandoned here means the waste. It means the manure. Okay? So it means dung. Okay, horse dung. So it's saying there is a belief that you can make a poultice, right, out of horse dung, right? And if you make a poultice out of it, and somebody, let's say you're a boxer, or somehow you injure yourself and you have a bad bruise, if you put the poultice of horse dung on it, it will help to relieve the pain. It will alleviate the pain.
Yeah.
Right? So that says tapangki numba. Numba means like a blow, like a physical blow. La deor semba. Okay? So this is saying that pleasant experiences are like applying horse dung to a punch as a way of alleviating the pain that you experience when you're punched, and thinking that that's pleasant, and being punched.
Yeah.
So, okay. The reason that I'm going to the trouble of referring to the simile is that the two English translations, I think they blew it. This is Karen Lang says, but this is where it's page 150. He says, no, wait a minute. No, 149. He says, consider the example of swallowing horse dung. He says, someone thinks that swallowing horse dung will relieve pain and swallows it with pleasure. I think they butchered the translation. But all it means is that you can, and I think there are, cases where people think of taking dung and putting it on, a wound or something like that, that somehow that alleviates the pain, right? So that alleviating of the pain is thought of as something pleasant. Well, it's not. It's just alleviating the pain. And so that's why it's being used as the simile here.
Yeah.
And so life is really nothing more than, it's when you get punched, then you put a little horse dung on it and it makes you feel better, so you think that's pleasant. And so running around looking for ordinary pleasures is like smearing horse dung. And so that's part of the reason for the simile, is that kind of ridiculousness of of the parallel. It's meant to, it's meant to indicate that pursuit of ordinary pleasures is a misguided way of life. Okay, so that's that. All right, so let's move on to the next verse 22. Okay, so verse 22 is also very interesting. So he says, this is saying, this is a little bit difficult to read. So it says Zamba, right? Zamba in the Tibetan. You find it? You have the verse? The Tibetan?
The verse in Tibetan. I have,
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the first half of the verse says, if Zamba means to initiate something.
Mhm.
So it's saying this is still following on the same theme of alleviating a more intense pain is what we perceive as pleasant experiences.
Mhm.
So he says the commencement of something, right,
Mhm.
or starting something. So the starting of the something is what you do to alleviate an existing pain,
Mhm.
right? So, right, if you're feeling hot, so what do? You go into a Starbucks because it happens to be air conditioned,
Mhm.
right? So the pain that has arisen and you're actually experiencing, you want to do something to alleviate it. So you start something, right? You start something means you go into a place where there's air conditioning. So here it says, the starting of something can reverse something that already arose, right? Gyeva means something that has arisen. And something that has arisen is past tense. Something that has arisen means an existing pain that has arisen. By starting some new experience, it can have the effect of reversing that pain that you're currently experiencing. He says, it may be the case that initiating something, this is a beautiful verse, by the way, philosophically and in other ways. It may be the case that the initiating of something will reverse something that had been produced previously, or something that had arisen previously. But he says, you've actually only initiated a new form of suffering. So why is even that initiating of a suffering, how does that constitute an actual pleasant experience? What is the actual pleasantness that comes by initiating a new experience, which is actually a form of suffering? So what pleasure is there when all you're doing is creating some lesser form of pain to block out the greater form of pain? So how does that initiating of that lesser form of pain constitute an actual or genuine form of experience that is pleasurable? Okay, that's a little tough to read and to understand that way. And then we have this really beautiful reference. Therefore, and second half of the verse, therefore, the Muni, Buddha Shakyamuni, said, arising and passing away, both understood, right? Both are suffering. Consider that. Therefore, consider how the Buddha said that both arising and passing away are forms of suffering. Okay? Now that's an allusion to a sutra passage. Okay? And the sutra passage that's identified by Chandrakirti is called, he calls it Advice to Katyayan. Katyayan Mengak, I think it says. Katyayan Damnak. Okay? And there's no such sutra in Tibetan. In the Prasanapada, right? Prasanapada is Chandrakirti's commentary to Nagarjuna's 27 chapter Tawashita, right? In his commentary, he quotes from a text that he calls Katyayana's instruction to Katyayana, some sutra. He says, the Sutra of Instruction to Katyayana. Now, in that passage, in the Prasanapada, the reference is to the avoidance of the extremes of existence and non-existence. That to believe that things exist is an extreme, to believe that things don't exist is also an extreme. So the extremes of eternalism and nihilism. It doesn't make reference to the fact that things arise and pass away are both forms of suffering. Okay? But in the this is this passage. This is page that is found in the Hinayana collection. Now, there really is no extensive Hinayana collection of the Sanskrit collection, right? So the Sanskrit collection is called what do they call them? They use a different word. I'm blanking on it right now. In the Hinayana, they call them Nikayas, the 5 Nikayas. There are the extensive discourses. There's the numerical discourses. And then there's Samyutta Nikaya is connected discourses. Okay, and so in the collection of the connected Nikayas of discourses, there is a short sutra, and that's what this handout is. Okay, so I changed it a little bit in the Hinayana version is in the Pali, so maybe the Pali words are not familiar to you. So I changed the words just to be more familiar. Right. So it says the Lord, this thing is Shravasti. Right. So the Pali word is not Shravasti. I don't know what's it, Shavati or something like that. And then it says Kachana Gota. Kachana Gota. You see this. You see the heading for it? Kaccana. That in Sanskrit is Katyayana. So I inserted Katyayana. Because in Sanskrit, in Chandrakirti's works, he refers to the Sanskrit version. And so in the Tibetan, in fact, they use Katyayana la Damba. Katyayana la Damba. Right? Damba means instruction to Katyayana. Okay, so I don't want to waste time, but this is a very short sutra. And the sutra is generally talking about what one should consider, how one should properly consider what constitutes right view. Big word, right? So it says, Katyayana goes to the Buddha and he says to him, Venerable Sir, the expression right view is uttered. It means we have that expression, that word is used. In what way is there right view? How should we understand what that means, right? And now then there are 3 paragraphs here that are the answer to it. Okay, the first paragraph talks about existence and non-existence, right? And so that's the one that's quoted in the Prasanapada. It says, Katyayana, for the most part, this world depends upon a duality, right? The duality of existence versus non-existence. Some things exist, some things don't exist, right? But he says, so he says, but Katyayana, for one who sees the origin of the world, right? Someone who rightly understands how the world comes into being. By that, kind of at one level, that's talking about the 12 limbs of dependent origination, how the world comes into being, right? That's arising, origin. It says, then one will not have the idea that there is non-existence. There's no non-existence. one way of thinking of non-existence is at the end of life, right, comes oblivion, right? So in doctrine of 12 limbs of dependent origination, forget about it. There is perpetual rebirth, right? So that person doesn't think, the person who understands the way the world comes into being does not form the idea of non-existence, right? And then in the same token, the person who understands how the cessation of the world comes about. Cessation of the world comes about means the 12 limbs of how the 12 limbs of dependent origination are reversed. By the cessation of ignorance, there's a cessation of karma. By the cessation of karma, the cessation of consciousness. By cessation of consciousness, and so on. And in that way, there's no rebirth. You put an end to rebirth. So then that person who understands how the cessation of the world really occurs, that person does not believe that there is existence, meaning that there's no perpetual existence of samsara, meaning samsara can be brought to an end. So the person who understands how samsara is perpetuated, and one way to think of it is the person who understands how samsara is perpetuated, as well as how samsara can be brought to an end, that person has right view. That person will not have a mistaken idea that what actually exists doesn't exist, and what can be brought to a state of non-existence will not understand that that's possible. Right? That's one way of interpreting that first paragraph. Okay. Actually, the Madhyamikans take it to a much deeper level and say that this is saying that reality is something that's beyond the concepts of existence and non-existence, and that's how it's being introduced. So it's almost like saying, it's not the classic example, but it's almost like saying, well, here's an example where the Buddha is teaching emptiness in the Hinayana Sutra. It's not the classic example of that, but it's quoted in the Prasanapada. Now here's the second paragraph. The second paragraph has this passage in it. So in the second paragraph, it's talking about the first part of how the person sees origination, right, properly. And so how samsara is brought into existence. And so he starts by talking about sort of the psychology of cognition. He says, for the most part, this world is shackled by engagement. Engagement means engaging objects, right? And so I think I put in parentheses that this word is referring to mind coming near to objects, right? Grasping means then developing attachment for those things that you perceive, right? That you find attractive. And adherence means then you form mistaken notions about those things that you perceive. But this one who possesses right view, it means the one who understands how samsara is perpetuated. I mean, that means they know the nature of mental afflictions. They know the nature of error. Then that person doesn't become engaged and cling to that engagement and cling to mental sign, blah, blah, blah. He does not take a stand about myself. It means he does not form a notion of a real self. And here's about the truth of suffering. He has no perplexity or doubt that whatever arises is only suffering arising, and whatever ceases is only suffering ceasing. That's the passage here. Okay? So whatever arises and whatever passes away, both of them are suffering. It's suffering that arises, and when it passes away, when that experience passes away, it's suffering that passes away. So that's so his knowledge about this is independent of others, means he or she understands it by their own understanding, and is this way that there's right view. So that means the person who understands the nature of samsaric existence correctly is not going to be drawn into samsara, and is going to see all of samsara as suffering. Both, the things that arise as suffering, that here he's using. Arising is saying, when you initiate some activity, right, that replaces some kind of more intense form of suffering, what's really arising is a new samsaric experience. because it's a samsaric experience, it's unsatisfactory,
Mhm.
and therefore it's a form of suffering.
Mhm.
And whatever is ceasing, right? Whatever previous experience is ceasing, that too is only an unpleasant thing, which is ceasing. So this is the kind of statement that that Aryadeva is referring to here. So consider the fact that Buddha said that even all things that arise are suffering things. All things that cease are, samsaric in nature, and therefore it's suffering that's ceasing. Okay. Now, this contrasts with the more conventional Buddhist idea of the suffering of change. So, in the suffering of change, here's what Vasubandhu says. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Where is the passage? Let's see. It's a quote. No, it's just come back here. Okay. Like, three states of suffering. Oh yeah. Okay, so this I quote this in page one, bottom 109 and 110, and this is from the Abhidharmakosha commentary. So it's introducing chapter 6, I think verse 3. Chapter 6 is on the truth, the path, in the nature of the path is in the Abhidharmakosha where the four truths are addressed. So here's Vasubandhu. He's saying, when only a portion of feelings has the nature of suffering, how is it that all impure conditioned entities are said to constitute suffering? Okay, and so he says, impure. This is a verse from the Abhidharmakosha root text. It says, impure entities that are attractive, unattractive, and different from those two, meaning neither attractive nor unattractive, are without exception forms of suffering because they are subject as appropriate to the three states of suffering. Right? So painful experiences represent the suffering. Pleasant experiences represent the suffering of change. And those which are neutral represent the suffering of conditioned existence. Okay, here's the passage. Regarding this, those impure conditioned entities that are attractive, meaning that are pleasant, right, are characterized by suffering in terms of the suffering of, oh wait a minute, let's see. Oh yeah, skip down. He says, a pleasant feeling is a state of suffering in that it undergoes change, right? So this is basically the idea of why it's called the suffering of change. It undergoes change, meaning it doesn't last. It's pleasant for a while, but at some point it ends, right? And it's when it ends that we experience the unpleasantness of it. So he says, as the sutras declare, okay, now this is Vasubandhu saying something else. A pleasant feeling is pleasant when it arises, okay? And pleasant while it lasts, but unpleasant when it undergoes change, okay? So that's a classic notion of, pleasant sensations. We experience them, we like them, we enjoy them, we want them to continue, not to end. And then all of a sudden they do end, and then we're let down. So that's very different from the passage from the Katyayana Sutra, which says the person who has right view understands that whatever arises, whatever is arising, is the arising of suffering. And whatever passes away is the passing away of suffering. So that's a more universal statement, right? That's saying Therefore, there is no such thing as real pleasure.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's what this verse is alluding to. And let's see. Again, so the idea is the same. It's saying the commencing of something is what you do to, to replace some greater form of unpleasantness. So the replacing of another greater form of unpleasantness is accomplished by initiating something.
Mm.
So the initiating of something blocks out something that's worse, right?
Right.
And therefore it causes it to disappear.
Mhm.
However, if you think what the Buddha said, that thing that you initiated is actually just another form of suffering, right?
Mhm.
So how can the initiating of suffering, because it's samsaric in nature, how is it that the initiating of suffering itself can be thought of or can be identified as a form of pleasantness, a real, genuine form of pleasantness, right?
Mhm.
That's what Arya Deva said. This says, forget about initiating something that's actually painful, right? So there's there was some thought that was going through my mind as I was talking about that, saying, God, I can't remember it now. So let's see. Let's see. Dunge sarva shenton bala ang dewachi yu, dunge chenbo kak shimbala yang dewachi yu. Oh yeah. So Gesabje takes a little bit of a well. Let's read what Chandrakirti says. I find his kind of more he kind of gives a little bit of a more expansive description of how to understand the verse. So he says about this one. He says. Kar dungel chenbo kewe zombe dunayang dungel chungu kewe topso. So again, he makes the statement. He says that this new experience that's initiated to replace something more painful. He says the way that we know that experience that was initiated is actually a form of pain is because eventually, right, finally, that new experience is going, as time goes by, is going to take on a more overt form of unpleasantness. So therefore, we know that its essential quality at the beginning was just a less intense form of unpleasantness. He said, "Dunge chumu keba deyang ngargi yerbo tokpe gyu yimbe dunge chumu toman ngargi dunge la keba dokper gyu kebe jani pewe ramjo." So he says here, the thing that in the verse it says keba, right? Keba means that which has arisen, and then Chandrakirti says that which has arisen means that which has a more intense form of unpleasantness to it. Pelwe raptujo. Pelwe means something which is in a more fully what should I say, developed, a fully developed form of unpleasantness, the thing which has arisen. The new thing that's being initiated is not yet fully developed, and therefore it has this semblance of pleasantness to it in the beginning, right? Okay, so that's one point. It says, angija. Okay, so there's a word, ang. Ang here it says, even the beginning, even the initiating of suffering, how can that be thought of as pleasantness, right? So the word even needs to be explained here. He says, not only is the initiating of suffering improperly considered to be a form of pleasantness, right? The cessation of suffering too, right? The thing which is brought to an end. How is that a genuinely a genuine form of pleasantness. All it is the disappearance of something which was more intensely unpleasant. So how can the disappearance of something that is intensely unpleasant be thought of as pleasantness? That's what the even is. The initiating of a new experience, which is essentially unpleasant, how can that be a form of pleasantness? And also, how can the cessation of the previous unpleasantness be identified as a form of genuine pleasure? Right. So then think of then in the second half of the verse, he makes that reference to the fact that the Buddha said in this one sutra that anything samsaric which arises is the arising of suffering. Anything which is terminated is also the termination of something unpleasant, some form of suffering. Well, yeah. So that's an interesting kind of appeal to scriptural passage to support this view that the abatement of suffering is not real pleasure. And this goes counter to the conventional view of, as represented by, for example, Vasubandhu in the Bhagavad Gita. Here we ought to read this because it's just, I think it's just pleasant to go through it. He gives the simile, and this simile the translations get right, and it's quite interesting. Let's see. Oh, yeah, he gives it here in Get Subject also. He says, "Perna." Let's see. The wording of the simile is there actually are two to this that go to this verse. One of them is let's see. 194. No. Oh, this one's different. Yeah. This simile is the simile is the simile of the next verse. The simile to this verse is I'm not even going to try to explain because it says something. You can read the translations. I don't know that they make. I don't know how to read them. It sounds like it's something about being bound by some kind of some kind of rope made out of some kind of the strands of like bark or hemp or something like that. Some kind of what do you call that?
Fibrous,
like some fibrous material, and then it says the sun and the rain can cause them to if someone who is bound by them, because the idea seems to be that those fibrous materials are fragile, and that the elements can cause them to deteriorate and disintegrate, and you can be freed from them. I don't know how to interpret it for this verse, so I'm going to leave it. Jetzabgit doesn't even refer to it. The only thing he says is he makes mention to that thing about shifting a burden from one shoulder to the other, which is that famous way of understanding what the suffering of changes from the Madhyamika view. Okay, so next verse, 223. This one is also interesting. So let's focus on the verses and then maybe try not to take too much time to talk about them. So it says, another way of interpreting suffering and the relationship between suffering and pleasure is that there is suffering. Suffering is widespread. But then ordinary persons don't see the suffering, the underlying suffering of life, because they pursue ordinary pleasures, and they immerse themselves in those ordinary pleasures, and those ordinary pleasures obscure the underlying suffering of ordinary existence.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Falling asleep on the chair.
I'm sorry?
Falling asleep on the chair. I woke up
Oh.
early this morning.
Oh, I see. Oh,
Not
okay.
the lecture, not the lecture.
You're in the same boat as Louise.
Louise went to three.
Yes, we know. Okay, so so go back to the verse. This is verse 23. It says, the reason that ordinary person, right, the non-Arya, the ordinary samsaric being, the reason that the ordinary samsaric being doesn't recognize the suffering nature of samsaric existence is because he or she is kind of, what should I say, excessively involved in pursuing ordinary pleasures. And so therefore they experience those ordinary pleasures, which temporary though they may be, nevertheless are pleasures, and they are deluding themselves, and yet, because those pleasures are temporary, and yet what they do is they experience one pleasure, for example, and then once that pleasure ends, well, then they just try to replace it with another pleasure, and they go through life just, trying to go from one pleasure to another, and therefore they're sort of, what's the word? It's a form of avoidance, a form of avoidance of the all-pervasive suffering that exists in the world by, immersing them in themselves in temporary pleasure, something like that. So it says, so I translated, if you claim that suffering is not seen by the ordinary person, the reason that the ordinary person doesn't recognize the truth of suffering as suffering is because that suffering is veiled, is obscured by their ordinary experiences. If you say that, then so that's a mistaken understanding of the way ordinary persons pursue, meaningless pleasures, and fail to recognize the underlying suffering of samsara, and therefore seek to, free themselves from it, is because, it's like this. So what is the nature of, the worldly God's realms? The worldly God's realm. What? So they talk about there are 8 inopportune states, right? There's Dawagye, right? The 8 leisures, and the 10 fortunes. And among the 8 leisures, 4 of them are related to human existence. 4 of them relate to, the 4 absence of leisures are human, and the 4 remaining absence of leisures or the inopportune states are non-human. And one of them, the 3 of them are the lower realms, which are pervaded by suffering. We don't give you the opportunity to pursue Dharma. One of them is to be born in the worldly God realms, because in the worldly God realms, beings are just overwhelmed by pleasurable experience, so they have no desire to pursue Dharma because they experience nothing but pleasure. So in that case, you could say that pleasure obscures their minds and prevents them from seeing the suffering nature of the world, right? So in the same way, the ordinary person, as a human, even as a human being, does the same thing to sort of cover up the essentially painful nature of life by, pursuing meaningless pleasures, right? If that's your idea of why the ordinary person does not recognize the truth of suffering as suffering, Aryadeva says, well, guess what? There ain't no such thing as pleasure. Again, here he says, there's no such thing as pleasant, as genuine pleasantness, which could obscure their suffering. Gangi dungel jukjurwa means that by which their suffering is obscured. Dewa shecha, that thing called pleasantness, jiangme, there's no such thing at all. It doesn't exist, right? So there's nothing that could obscure them. They're just replacing one form of suffering with another. Right? Again, this is part of this idea of the Madhyamika view, that there's no such thing as genuine pleasure, and this, what we call the suffering of change, is the way the Madhyamikans interpret it, is that a mistaken way of perceiving lesser forms of discomfort as pleasurable. Okay, so let's not. We don't need to talk about the idea. There is that the essence of the verse, I think, is pretty clear. So what we will read is the simile, and there are two similes for this verse. One of them is let's see. You can look it up. I think we'll only do one of them of the two. One of them is let's see. Oh yeah, Trembe Chedu Hungwa Dansi Nyang Be Tumbata. So that is a kind of odd phrase, a kind of a longish phrase. It says, for example, the person who relies on tasting honey, the person being someone who has fallen halfway down a well. It's like that, okay? And then the other simile is like the crow who has sought refuge inside the carcass of an elephant during a like a flood. So you can read the second one from the translations. I just want to read through the first one because I think it's really it's kind of enjoyable in its complexity. So this is sort of how to properly understand the essence of this verse, which is that the idea that we obscure the suffering nature of samsara is, it may be the case. It may be the case that ordinary persons, in fact, are sort of, what's the word? The word is, they become absorbed in the pursuit of pleasures, and that kind of pursuit blinds them to the fact that they're not able to see suffering. So Arideva's answer to that is, there is no pleasure, there's no real pleasure that could blind them. But it is true that ordinary persons do, kind of become absorbed in that kind of misguided pursuit. Okay, so here's the simile. So the simile says, imagine a person who's being chased by a mad elephant, a wild elephant. So a wild elephant could trample him to death. So in order to escape a wild elephant, he finds an old abandoned well. Trumbanimba means an old well. And he falls into that well, and halfway down the well, Lamchedu, there's some durva grass, which is growing out from the side of the well. What do you call it? Shaft of the well, or the body of the well? And so he grabs onto that durva grass. And by the way, durva grass is a grass that it has the auspicious quality of being associated with longevity, right? So that there's this idea of living for a long time, that the ordinary person does not address their mortality. Right? So grafts onto durva grass, and the roots of the durva grass are being nibbled by some sort of rodent. Jiwe sashima. Jiwa means the rodent is nibbling away at the roots of the durva grass. So what that means is it's just a matter of time before the durva grass gives way and he falls down the rest of the well, right? Jishimbala, Juwe means Juwe Tokpa means Juwa means he's grasping onto the durva grass, and Tokpa means and that sort of holds him up. Normally, Tokpa means to be obstructed, but here it means his fall is interrupted, right? By holding onto the durva grass. However, because the rodents are nibbling at it, it's not going to be able to hold on to it in such a way that it's going to keep him from falling. So he's going to fall, and he says below there is a great snake. It says Drul Chembo Gakpa. Drul Chembo Gakpa means actually the word for that snake is a Sanskrit word is called Ajagara. Ajagara means literally goat swallowing snake. Goat swallowing snake means it's a huge python, right? So that huge python is waiting at the bottom of the well, and of course, if he falls down there, it's going to wrap itself around him and squeeze the life out of him. Also, Mwene means on the sides of the well, there are also Toje Chembo Nyek. Toje is another word for snake. Uraga. Uraga means that which goes on its belly, right? Travels on its belly. Then lots of poisonous snakes are, reaching out to him, right? Then, at the same time as he's there, Zhangzi Tigbabab, there are drops of honey are falling down the well shaft, and so this person is tasting that honey and thinking all is well. So it says, Nyangbala Tembashik. Nyangbala Tembashik means the person is oblivious to all those things that are around him, all these things that are a threat to him, and because he's able to taste a few drops of honey that are falling into his mouth, he thinks, my life is good. I'm enjoying happy. My life is happy. Jiva Nam says, similarly, Jiva means this is now the ordinary person. Jiva means literally means a child, a spiritual, an immature, spiritually immature beings. That means the non-Aryas, the worldly samsaric beings. They are Korwar Chingwe Langching Gi De, means they are being driven by the great elephant, which is the bonds of samsara. And they have fallen into the well of old age. Okay, so here we are. I can say I feel like I've reached that part of the well. And Geve Trumban Hongbe means they've reached old age, and having fallen there halfway down the well means not dead. Then Gewe Le means virtuous activities. Gewe Lelam means karmic paths. Gewe Lelamgi Za Durwa. Za Durwa means the Durva grass represents carrying out virtuous deeds. Zawa La Juve means we're relying on that as a way to save us. However, from below, the snake, in this case the python or the constrictor snake of the lower realms is waiting for us. Gak means waiting there. Mwene nyomongbe toche. Then from the sides, the additional snakes of the mental afflictions are reaching out to us, meaning that we are vulnerable to giving rise to the mental afflictions, then in such circumstances, zadurwa means the virtue that we are able to rely upon. Zawa namin means the ripening of those virtuous deeds are being eaten away by the rodents. So namin means our current life is one that was produced by our virtue in former life. That's what the tzadurwa is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the durwa grass of whatever longevity we have in our current life represents the ripening of our previous good karma in a past life. Then that's being eaten away by rodents, right? Being eaten away by rodents is then the fact that that life is not indefinite, right? It's going to come to an end sooner rather than later. And yet, at the same time, yul yiduwa means attractive objects, right? What are they? Yul yiduwa seva means having desire, having attachment, craving for attractive objects. That is the ordinary samsaric being who is driven by his or her desire to gratify their sensory pleasures. Then that is represented by the drops of honey that the person is tasting. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that one is living one's life in such a way that one puts greatest emphasis on pursuing those kinds of ordinary temporary pleasures. The fact is that life is really marked by suffering and the potential for suffering at every turn, as exemplified by this extended simile. Therefore, Dewarang Zemba Chungsek Jang Medo. Dewarang Zemba means there's really, he's saying there's that the idea that there is some kind of real pleasures, that is a delusion. That is a fantasy. There are no such real pleasures, and yet we the unenlightened samsaric being is deluded in the idea that there is, and therefore wastes one's life, and ignores the fact that samsara is pervaded by suffering, and the appropriate perspective is to give up all of those false appearances of pleasure and recognize suffering for what it is, and therefore be motivated to try to free yourself from that condition. Okay, so that's that verse. Let's see, we've got two more. So the next one is the one that we actually mentioned, I think, a couple of classes ago, which is to say, so this is just the way this is the way this verse is introduced. Again, this is Chandakirti sort of giving us a kind of his segue for the verse is quite I think helpful to understand it. She says, well, wait a minute. So the person might say, well, wait a minute. You're telling me there's no such thing as happiness. So far up to now, you're saying all perception or all thoughts about happiness are false, and we're the only thing that there is suffering, right? So now he kind of flips the narrative around, and he says, if everything is nothing but suffering, and there's no such thing as real pleasantness at all, why do you need to tell people that? If there really is nothing but unpleasantness, shouldn't that be obvious? And shouldn't everybody recognize it, right? So he says here, he says, "Gete dunge rashingi drumna di nyortame gravachishigyo." Says if it's true that everything is nothing but suffering, then what need is there to say that, right? Means why do you need to, write this spiritual treatise in which you're trying to beat us over the head with this idea that everything is suffering? He says, "Nitsen dro she mawe nyortambani devamayino." He says, so it's like saying the sun rays are hot. The sun rays are hot. Don't need to say that. Everybody knows that. So if in fact everything is suffering, then everyone should see that. And so there's no need to talk about it. Everyone should be able to see it, right? So that's the argument. So then Ayadeva's answer to that is kind of saying, would that it were so? Wouldn't it be nice if people were able to recognize suffering as suffering? Then he says, "Kyo duk chakjel medo she," right? Kyo means you. This is a phrase. This is a quote, meaning it's a statement, which is being hypothetically, but I don't know that it's a quote of any actual sutra, but it's saying, in effect, what the Buddha is saying is, in his first line, says, you have not been, you have failed to overcome your attachment to suffering. So you are someone who is attached to what actually is suffering, meaning you're attached to samsara. You're attached to samsaric existence. And samsaric existence is suffering. And so therefore you don't realize that what you are attached to is actually suffering. So the idea is that you are so deluded that you are not able to see that you are attracted to what is actually suffering, and you are just maintain desire for what is really unfavorable, which is unsatisfactory. So that is what the ordinary person needs to be educated on. This sosokyo tenja means the thing which the ordinary person needs to be taught is that he or she doesn't realize that you are being attached, you are continuing to be attached to what is in fact a form of unpleasantness, right? That is, then the Buddhas, in fact, that is what the Buddhas were meant when they said, "Dimi dume pape dambao." This is the noble truth of suffering. So, and then the Buddha, in fact, said that the worst kind of ignorance is this ignorance about the nature of suffering, right? So the Buddhas, the Tathagatas, have said that the worst kind of ignorance is the ignorance that fails to realize that our attachment to samsara is actually an attachment to something that is suffering. And if we recognize something to be suffering, then we will be able to give up. Nobody enjoys, quote, suffering. So if you saw it to be suffering, then you would be more than happy to let go of it. But the fact that you don't perceive it to be suffering you cling to it.
Hmm.
And so that's the deepest kind of ignorance. Okay. So yeah. So the meaning is like that. And so it's saying while suffering is staring us in the face, we are not able to see it for what it is. Okay. So that verse is, we've gone over that verse a little bit. So we can leave it at that. Then the last verse is the final category of the outline is to say, karasana. Right? So this final verse is addressing what is the suffering of conditioned existence. And so then the kind of, again, the segue is that it says even though our bodies are impermanent, right? They are subject to change and therefore impermanent. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as pleasure, which this impermanent body is able to experience. And so what's wrong with pursuing pleasure through this body? So then the answer to that is this verse. Then it says, that which is impermanent is with a certainty, right? Definitely is a form of harm. That which is subject to that which is impermanent is undergoing a form, represents a condition that is a harmful condition. The fact that your body is constantly changing is an unpleasant condition to have to endure, right? Then it says that it's a form of harm in the sense that it is ceasing to exist, right? It's being taken away moment by moment. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it is a form of harm. Then that which is a form of harm cannot be considered a form of ease or well-being. If it's a form of harm, it is a form of unsatisfactoriness. Therefore, everything that is impermanent must be a form of suffering. Okay, that's the verse. Now, this is what represents the deeper meaning of the truth of suffering. So, I think let's see, I have a passage here about the suffering of conditioned existence. Let's see where it is here. Oh yeah, here. Okay. So there is a verse in that. In fact, this is in Pramanavartika, the second chapter of the Pramanavartika, and it's near the end of the chapter. This verse. It's like 200, almost 290 verses. This is verse 253. And so the latter part of the second chapter is a very detailed and very extensive discussion of the Four Noble Truths. So these lines say, it says, he, meaning Buddha, had the suffering of condition in mind when he said that one should meditate upon suffering. So it meant that the most refined or the most subtle or the most profound aspect of the noble truth of suffering is the suffering of conditioned existence. Okay? Then, so it's saying the suffering of conditioned existence, properly understood, sort of takes precedence over the other two forms of suffering, right? So Just in my mind, if we take the three kinds of suffering, right? The suffering of suffering is a way to understand its kind of spiritual implications is based on the doctrine of karma. That if you engage in wrongful conduct, right? Conduct meaning conduct that's motivated by mental afflictions, then that kind of conduct is not inconsequential. That kind of conduct will produce suffering. It can produce suffering in this life, then that's called tointure. Tointure means that which is seen within this very lifetime. But even more significantly, it can ripen in a future life in the sense of an unfavorable rebirth, which is fraught with the worst kind of suffering we can imagine, literally. So that's kind of the focus of the suffering of suffering. So painful sensations is not to say just that element of suffering is not just to say, oh, pain is unpleasant. Who likes pain? We should give it up. I think also implicit in that aspect of suffering is the moral element of it, which is to say, painful experiences, which are part of samsaric experience, are due to our own inappropriate behavior. And therefore, that's a significant aspect of samsaric existence, is that we are the creators of our own suffering. And that's undesirable. And therefore, if we want to avoid that, we need to be mindful of our behavior, right? That's one way of thinking about suffering and samsaric condition. Then the pleasant sensations also need to be, we need to be wary of ordinary pleasant sensations mainly because they are what lead us to deepen our attachment to ordinary pleasures, and then that attachment is going to be the root cause that will perpetuate samsaric existence. So that will keep us bound in samsara. So that's also something that's undesirable. So that's an aspect of the truth of suffering, or one way to think of it, right? Leave alone all the things which the Madhyamikans say about pleasure experiences not really being pleasurable experiences. But then we get to this one, the suffering of conditioned existence, and that's really the the most significant element of that first of the Four Noble Truths. So, in order to understand that, we need to be aware of subtle impermanence. Without understanding subtle impermanence, it's not really possible to properly appreciate the nature of conditioned existence. Okay? The suffering of conditioned existence. So, in connection with that, then here is a description of how to understand a kind of a doctrinal kind of unpacking or explanation of what the term the suffering of condition refers to. And this is from Asanga's Shravaka Bhumi. So he this is probably the most expansive description that he gives. Okay, so I sent this as one of the handouts.
Yeah, sorry, this is the one I forgot. This is the second email.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I sent it late last night to Andy, but it's in the Inner Science. I put it in Inner Science. It's on. I'll give you the page number. It's okay. So the subject of suffering and conditioned existence starts on page 120, and this particular passage is on 122, and then I talk about it some more a few more pages. So this passage is from, as I said, from Asanga's Shravaka Bhumi, right? So it's not very long, but it's very should I say it's very dense in what it's saying. So it has two parts to it. The first part is identifying the entities that are characterized by the suffering conditions. So what are those phenomena? What are those dharmas? What are those conditioned entities that can be labeled as indicative of the suffering conditioned existence? So that's the first part. So he says here, he starts out by saying, the suffering of conditioned existence, Nyarlimbe Pumbu means the five skandhas, which are the five grasping skandhas. So what that means is the five skandhas in and of themselves are not impure, right? The Buddhas have five skandhas. So their skandhas are not grasping skandhas, right? So when you say grasping skandhas, sometimes it's the contaminated grasping skandhas. So that is the truth of suffering, is the contaminated grasping skandhas, five skandhas, from the perspective of being a result. Okay, that's the truth of suffering. Okay, so here he says, the suffering of conditioned existence is tamje de droite. It means it is all pervasive. How do I translate it here? It is present in every form of the five closely grasping heaps. So it's saying then that element of the five grasping heaps that are characterized by unpleasantness, by overt suffering, and all the other elements of the five skandhas that are associated with it and accompany it or exist at the same time, those are indicative mainly of the suffering of suffering. But underlying that suffering of suffering is the suffering of conditioned existence. It's there as well. Same is true for the suffering of change. We have pleasant experiences, right? Those are, temporary, or what should I say? They are infrequent, right? They are sometimes pleasant, sometimes not, right? So, but whenever they are present, the suffering of conditioned existence is also present. All right. So, and then there are neutral states, and then during those neutral states, the suffering is not there. The suffering of change is not there, but the suffering of conditioned existence is there. Okay. So therefore, the suffering of conditioned existence is present in every form of the five grasping skandhas, and that's, I think, why the Tibetans say, they don't just say Dujekidunga, they say Kyaba Dujekidunga. Kyaba means that it's all pervasive. The term all pervasive condition, the suffering of conditioned existence, doesn't include that notion of being all pervasive in the term itself. It just says samskara dukkata. It means the suffering, the state of suffering that characterizes all conditioned existence. So it says, it's present in every form of the five closely grasping heaps, and then this is what they refer to. In brief, this is what that refers to, right? It refers to leaving out, right, excluding the forms of the heaps that represent the suffering of suffering. So that means the suffering of suffering has the pervasion of the suffering of conditioned existence in it, but it also is characterized by suffering of suffering. So put that aside. Same thing, and then so the second thing that's excluded is the form of the suffering of, this is a unique thing, which we didn't really talk about. This is something that Asanga, one element of the suffering of change is the change that is characterized by mental afflictions. So when we experience the mental afflictions are an agitated state of mind, right? And those mental afflictions do not represent our natural condition, right? Something has to happen, something has to trigger them,
and then we, give rise to the mental affliction.
Mhm.
And so that agitated state, Asanga describes as a form of the suffering of change, because that agitated state is not pleasant.
Mm.
They're not enjoyable.
Mhm.
It's not when, especially in the case of anger. A lot of times when we're angry, we don't like being angry. We're upset, and we're agitated, and even we would like to have that anger subside, but we can't, turn it off automatically. So anyway, one explanation of the suffering of change that Asanga gives is that it applies to those states that are, here he says, Kune nyomombe yonsu simbe. Kune nyomomba means the agitation that's brought on by the mental afflictions is a form of the suffering of change. Also, dewe tsorwa. Dewe tsorwa means then pleasant sensations, right? Dendam jewa means together with all the other aspects that are the other elements of the skandhas. Right? Dendam jewa refers to so the pleasant sensations plus the accompanying elements of the rest of the 5 skandhas are also gyurveduna. They're the suffering of change. So dematopa means putting them aside. Dele shembe pumbo. Dele shembe pumbo means there are other forms of the 5 skandhas, which are neither painful nor pleasant. Dewayang main, dungalayang main, dewayang mayimba. Right? That's a way of describing neutral feelings are things which are neither painful nor pleasurable. Dedang demba. Okay, so we have one is those actual states themselves of the painful sensation or the neutral sensations plus let's see, those remaining forms of the heaps that are accompanied by feelings that are pleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, not pleasant nor unpleasant. It means the 5 skandhas in those neutral experiential states, right? So that's one. Okay. Then he says number 2, those that arise from the heaps that were just described. Then that is Deleng Nyeberkewa. Deleng Nyeberkewa means then those neutral states of the 5 skandhas, they serve as causes for subsequent moments of those neutral states. So there's a continuity to them. So all the successive forms that remain in that same neutral state. So neutral state gives rise to other neutral states unless something else intervenes to cause you to have pleasant experiences or unpleasant experiences. Right? Then also those conditions which cause those neutral experiences to occur. Right? So those then that's talking about causality and what are the causal factors that cause those neutral sensations and those experiential states to occur. So that's a third category. And then the fourth one is the vessel, right? De junwa nebe shi. De junwa nebe shi means the external world, the inanimate world, also constitutes an aspect of the suffering of conditioned existence. Why? Because the inanimate world is also subject to subtle impermanence. Okay? So that's 4 categories of entities that, taken as a whole, are the elements that can be identified as characterized by suffering of conditioned existence. All right? So he says, those heaps, and now he gives you the qualities that are the reasons why they are a form of unsatisfactoriness. What is it about them that makes them a form of suffering per se? Okay, so then he makes here 7 points. Are they in the English? The 7 points? They're in the Tibetan.
Yes.
Or I'm sorry, they're in the English, but they're not in the Tibetan. I added in the Tibetan that I said.
Yeah, you put the numbers here.
Okay, so here it says. So he says, these are the things. Dedani Dujeki dumeshe jate. These are the things that are called the suffering of conditioned existence, right? Right before that, right?
Mhm.
Dedani dujeki dumeshe jate, right? So these are the things that are called suffering of conditioned existence. And he says, which are those skandhas which are impermanent. Mitakpa. Mitakpa means junwa dang jikwa dang demba. Impermanent means things which are subject to arising and passing away, right? That means those things which are subject to subtle impermanence. Those things which are conditioned, caused to arise, and arise in such a way that their disappearance is automatic, right? So that's what subtle impermanence is.
Mhm.
So that's number one, characterizing quality for why this is a form of suffering, right? And then it says lemba dangcheba. Lemba dangcheba means they are accompanied by grasping. They're accompanied by grasping means that, so in the case of our 5 skandhas, so the first thing is saying our 5 skandhas are subject to subtle impermanence, right? It's a basic condition. Then as we experience our momentary skandhas, then we give rise to grasping. Grasping means attachment for things. We see certain things, those things attract us, and we develop some kind of desire for them. Therefore, they are accompanied by grasping. We are subject to desire, and we manifest desire based on certain kinds of experiences that we have. So that's another qualifying characteristic. We could be, if we were arahats, right? We would have, and we were still alive, right? We would have the 5 skandhas. They would be impermanent, but we wouldn't have grasping. We wouldn't have any mental affliction, so we wouldn't respond to our ordinary experience in such a way that they would provoke attachment and desire. But for samsaric beings, all kinds of things cause us to take notice of them in such a way that they provoke our desire. So that's another qualifying attribute that defines suffering of conditioned existence. So we have desire, and although it doesn't say it, we don't have any control, or we can't turn that desire off. It's going to come, right? Then it says, that's number 2. Number 3 is they are closely connected with the 3 types of feeling. It means that our impermanent 5 skandhas that are subject to desire also at different times experience pleasurable sensations, at other times experience painful sensations, and also experience neutral sensations. So our 5 skandhas are accompanied by and are the cause for continuing to have these kinds of impure sensations. And then it says, now that's number 3. Number 4 is those 5 skandhas are accompanied by a state of indisposition, right? Ningen lindang demba. Ningen lindang demba means our 5 skandhas have a certain drag, have a certain heaviness that's associated with it. Our minds don't respond the way we would like to instantaneously, and our bodies certainly don't either, right? So our 5 skandhas are subject to that kind of resistance to whatever it is that we would like them to do. Then it says, that's number 4, right? Number 5, those five skandhas constitute a state in which we are not, our welfare is not secure. Drubadang dewa toka mayimba. This is a technical term that is not often encountered in the literature. It's yoga kshema. Kshema is a kind of like welfare or well-being. Yoga means to be joined to it. So yoga kshema means to have obtained well-being or peace or happiness or nirvana. Then ayoga kshema means it's absent. We are not in a secure state of well-being. there's a state of, we're subject to all kinds of dangers, samsaric dangers. That's number 5, yes? Then number 6 is we are not free from the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change. So the idea is that the suffering of change are these transitory states which are not necessarily inherently satisfactory. So the fact that we possess the mental afflictions are such that even though right now we may be in a calm or neutral state of mind, we have the seeds that will lead us to experience either samsaric sufferings or samsaric forms of pleasures, right, depending on our own actions. So we've not freed ourselves from being subject to the consequences of our own behavior. So we are not liberated from samsaric suffering and samsaric pleasures. That's number 6, I think. And then number 7 is the real kind of the qualitative aspect of all of these other 6 taken collectively, which is that all 6 of these conditions are conditions which we cannot control. They are rangi wangyurwa mete. We do not have the ability to free ourselves from them. We cannot free ourselves from the form of impermanence that we experience. We cannot free ourselves from the mental afflictions because we do not see our ultimate selfless nature. And as long as we have belief in the self, we're going to be motivated to gratify that self or protect that self, or be aggressive with anything that presents a potential harm towards that self. And so because of that, then as we experience this momentariness, which is pervaded by this heaviness of indisposition, and the fact that we cannot keep control over our own minds, and therefore it's unpleasant. That's the key. It's unpleasant to contemplate the fact that we have no control over our life in the long term. The idea that it's our existence is not under our we're not able to we're not masters of our own destiny, so to speak. And so that's the meaning of those are the main defining qualities of the suffering of conditioned existence. And this is, and then the closing statement is, this is a presentation of, this is a description of what the suffering of conditioned existence consists of. So these 7 qualifying attributes of those 4 categories of conditioned entities are how we should understand the suffering conditioned existence. This is one of the clearest presentations. Usually, the suffering conditioned existence is described simply as to be helplessly subject to wandering in samsara under the control of karma and mental affliction. The problem is that that doesn't do justice to understanding it at the level of subtle impermanence, and that this is a constantly changing condition, and that there's an inability for us to be able to remedy our certain condition that even if we understand it, right? Even if we understand what suffering condition of samsara is, there's no automatic fix to it. We can't just make it go away because we recognize it. It's a long and arduous process to free ourselves from samsara. And unless we have the opportunity to learn how to go about that process, we're not going anywhere. We're stuck. And so if you recognize that, that should be something that is alarming. And that's kind of the real kind of the deeper understanding of the truth of suffering. So that's kind of the final verse. We still have a little bit of time, and I wanted to, let's see, is there there are a few other handouts, or what do we have?
There was that other Yuti
sorry?
Sastik.
Oh, yes. Okay. So let's see. Yusti Shastika. Okay. So this is very good. Okay. So this is Yusti Shastika is Nagarjuna's 60 verses on reasoning, and the Tibetan to it is Chandrakirti's commentary. Okay, now this is crucial because at the end of the explanation of the verses, the 25 verses, Chandrakirti's commentary gives a really lengthy kind of discussion of a number of topics, including how he understands the suffering of change, and criticizes Vasubandhu. But at the outset of it, there is a statement which Getabje kind of gives a brief version of. So I don't know. Do you have the rest of Getabje's commentary to the chapter?
Yeah.
So let's see. Denchizeva, duja korokyo akene lana mebe chanjula kwebe chetu tole. Yawa dunela shesunga tembe shungame denchu. So I'm not going to be able to go over all this, and I really want to at least address these points. So I'm not going to read the Tibetan. Right after this is found in Chandrakirti's commentary. Right after he explains the last verse, it's in Karen Lang's translation, because he's translating his commentary for let's see,
152.
So this passage is okay. On the bottom of 152, Aryadeva's intention to free disciples from suffering. You see the paragraph?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there are 2 points that are made here. Okay. And this is very poetic. And so the Tibetan is kind of, there's the Sanskrit original, which doesn't exist, is one where you pile on kind of images, and sometimes they're expressed in the form of really long compounds. So when it gets translated into Tibetan, sometimes it's difficult to read. So what he's essentially doing is he's referring to what the purpose of this chapter is. So what is Aryadeva trying to do? He says in this chapter, did I translate this? Did I send you? I don't think I did. I think I might have translated it, but I guess I didn't. So he uses. Let's read this, because this is a fairly nice version of it. This is what's her name? Ruth Sunham's kind of abbreviated version of it. This is on page. So there's 2 points here. Well, the way I got it, the way I says, Chandrakirti is giving some kind of showing some kind of expression of admiration for Aryadeva, and he's saying the master Aryadeva, in this chapter, he has collected together and given a condensed presentation of what the Buddha had to say about the nature of suffering. Okay, that's kind of the essence of it. And then he gives this descriptive kind of way of how what is the reaction, what is the emotion that these verses are meant to engender in the reader. And so she says here, let's see. She doesn't really. I maybe guess up to this book. There's this thing about he's saying that the image is that that all sentient beings are immersed in the ocean of samsara, and in that ocean of samsara, it's not a tranquil ocean. It's an ocean that is filled with all kinds of predators, like all kinds of sharks and sea monsters that can cause us all manner of suffering. And so those are metaphors for birth, old age, suffering, and death. And then he gives another image where he says that samsara is like a whirlpool. Right, but this is idea that's not tranquil. It's not like sitting in a nice what do you call it? What are those?
Hot tub?
Hot tubs, yes. Not like sitting in a hot tub. He says it's like a whirlpool. If you're in a whirlpool, you're being tossed around, and it says, and it's like it's unpleasant, as if you were inside the hollow of a big drum. That's being beaten, and so the sound of the drum reverberating is kind of driving me crazy. So talks about that being the essential quality of samsara that we are subject to, and these verses are meant to convey to the disciples. Therefore, how does he put it here? He says, "Gyo, how does that do it? Gyo." Gyor Chao says that they should develop aversion. So the essence of meditating on suffering is to develop aversion, he says. And then he goes on, then makes a second point. He says, it's also, he says, this subject is important for, and this is a brief phrase. Lana mebe yandak bardokve chanchu ki sem mingi chembo. He says the bodhisattva is the ideal, right? This is a Mahayana text. So even though these first 8 chapters are introductory to the main subject of emptiness, that the subject of teaching suffering is not just a Hinayana subject to develop the aspiration to achieve nirvana. Also, he says, if you want to be a bodhisattva, he says, then the bodhisattva is meant to be the person who is intent upon supreme Buddhahood. And the goal of supreme Buddhahood that is being pursued by the bodhisattva has 2 essential qualities to it. You have to understand emptiness, and you have to have a bodhicitta. So he says, if you have emptiness alone, then that will not really, by itself, serve to inspire you to maintain the bodhicitta, which has compassion as its cause. So it's saying, there's what's at work there is it's saying, if you're a bodhisattva, you have to have an awareness of emptiness in order to further yourself towards enlightenment. And you also have to be practicing bodhicitta, right? And if you want to be able to practice bodhicitta, what sustains bodhicitta, what enables you initially to develop bodhicitta is compassion. But even after you develop bodhicitta, what enables you to sustain that bodhicitta is also compassion. So in order to maintain that bodhicitta, you have to maintain and, what should I say, reaffirm your compassion. And in order to reaffirm your compassion, you have to focus on the suffering of others. So the same suffering that you need to appreciate in order to develop aversion for samsara needs to be cultivated in order to maintain and support the bodhicitta that a bodhisattva needs. So you need to meditate on suffering for that purpose as well. That's really what I wanted to say at the very beginning of this class is one of the reasons why you need to study these 4 verses. So that's one point. Okay. Then the other point relates to emptiness, and this is where this Yukti Shastika comes in. Where is that? Yeah. So this is verse 30 in Nagarjuna's text, and what it says is, it says the following: a seeker of reality. A seeker of reality, that means somebody who wants to understand truth, right? The seeker of reality, that's a spiritual practitioner, right? A seeker of reality first should be told that everything exists. Okay? Later, one who has understood what is important and who is free of attachment. Okay? One who has understood the meaning, meaning understood the relative truth nature of samsara, and who has developed a sense of wanting not to maintain their attachment for samsara, then later they should be told, then the word is the state of being isolated. The state of being isolated means the state in which all things are free of any self-existent essence. So it's saying you should not teach emptiness until the person has understood renunciation. Basically, it's saying that. First renunciation, after renunciation, then you can be taught emptiness. So here, in brief, this is the message. And this is what I try to give you some of the highlights of how Chandakirti describes this verse. It's very nice. She says, in what way is someone, so the word is dönam tokshing. Dönam tokshing is the Sanskrit. I mean the root verse in the Tibetan. Dönam means artha. Artha means meaning. Tokpa means understood. Avagata artha. Avagata artha or dönam tokpa means what is the meaning that needs to be understood initially before one can be taught emptiness properly. He says, this is nice. He says, results are endless. They have no, samsaric results are infinite. They will go on forever. And for that reason, then he says, each individual result, so this would be like the ordinary things that we seek, right? Individual results, that means jeru rere. Jeru rere means each one individually, in that never-ending progression of samsaric existence. What does it take to produce a particular result? Let's say we as rational human beings who can survey our circumstances and have the intelligence to formulate some kind of rational, plan to achieve some kind of goal, right? So we say, here's a result that we want, right? So for instance, you know, what a comfortable life, shall we say, so that we can live out our our days, our final days in retirement, without any worries. So he says each individual result, right, in order to achieve it, can duma yerba. It says there are many different conditions that have to be, gathered in order to make even one single result produced.
Right.
So many causes are required even to produce one single result. Then, then if we look at each individual cause, each individual condition that is part of the many that we need to be able to collect in order to achieve our goal. Those, if we examine those, then then it said, just as samsara is something is beginningless, then all of the collections of causes are things which also have been occurring successively, one after the other, in such a way that they are endless, that the causes and the conditions that we seek are part of some endless progression. And therefore, in order to, let's see, where is it? Karasa. Gyutso timechik to gyube ta mitomechir jebu zomba la jikwatar dawe. So then it says, then we become a little bit more than unsettled. Jikwa means fearful. We become a little bit more than apprehensive about what we need to do, what effort we need to initiate. Zomba means to initiate, right? In order to achieve a result. So it says, Jui sokwa chik gyube drube jebu kendumale juan drumatang ne jigba toshin. Then also that collection of things that must be gyutsopa means collection of causes that must be achieved, right? That some degree of effort is necessary in order to bring them all together, and yet that result, right, jebu, which is kien dumale jua, means not easily acquired. In other words, if we really want results are not, we don't pick results off a tree. Right. We have to apply ourselves. We have to make effort. We have to have some kind of accurate and effective plan in order to achieve a result. Then it says that result, jebu kien dumale jua, matatu jikpatoshi. When we recognize that it's impermanent, in a subtle sense of impermanence, as soon as it's achieved, as soon as it has been obtained, it vanishes, it disappears. And kiawani, it's arising, in order to gain it, right? In order to cause it to come into being. Shintu bebe drubarchawainte. A great deal of effort must be exerted in order to cause ourselves to achieve it, and yet they don't last, right? Not only do they not last in the general sense of the word, they actually are they're like falling apart before our eyes. And so when we think about that, then the idea of seeking ordinary results becomes something that is sort of a fool's errand, right? So Shintu bebe druba jikpani beba mebaryang jumor togne. So it says that thing which is produced by much effort and which yet undergoes destruction effortlessly, right? Immediately. Then dujeki chini la gilupa. So when we have that understanding of subtle impermanence, that the result of that is, it says here, dujeki chini means that nature of conditioned entities is something that should, gilupa usually means laziness, but here it means more specifically, it should cause us to give up our otherwise strong tendency to want to pursue, for example, ordinary pleasure. And it would say to us, it's not worth it. So that gilupa here means give up the willingness to pursue ordinary pleasures. So I'm saying, that's dujeki chini la gilupa. I'm saying it's foolish. It's pointless for us to chase those evanescent pleasures of ordinary samsaric existence. And if it's foolish, then we should give it up. We should stop. Then, so it says, jiba kyo. Jiba kyo means those are ordinary foolish person, right? Jiba is an immature person. Jiba kyo jeba la. Jeba means their conduct. It means that the way ordinary everyday people, non-spiritual persons live their lives, chasing elusive happiness. Mambar mitaba usually means praise, right? But actually here, mambar mitaba is abhinanda. Abhinanda means delighting in, taking to be we should be on abhinanda, means we should give up are delighting at the pursuit of ordinary meaningless pleasures, for example. Gewala member migawa. Then gewala member migawa means we shouldn't have that sense of seeking to generate things. Jipala mitrabar zimba. Then we should feel that a sense of not despair, but a sense of kind of disillusionment with mitreba means I don't know what the Sanskrit is here. Oh yeah, mitreba means that it is apratikula means that is something that is it literally means against the grain. Against the grain means it is unfavorable. The fact that things are constantly undergoing disintegration, it means that those things that we chase they're not going to be something lasting that we can hold on to. And so therefore, even if we achieve the things that we pursue, then those things are mitreba, means they do not sort of conform to what our desires are. They're not going to give us what we thought we were seeking, right? So these are phrases that are meant to convey in a more subtle way what that notion of aversion is, right? So it means we shouldn't feel the desire to do what it takes to achieve those evanescent pleasures, and we should recognize those evanescent pleasures as being something that are not really going to give us the kind of lasting happiness that we think they will. So when we start to think like that, our disillusionment will kind of subside, and we will, or rather our sense of being deluded will subside, and we will kind of back off from samsara. So it says, Korwa nam la chakwa dorwar durva. Korwa nam la chakwa dorwar durva means we will want to abandon our attachment for samsaric existence. Korwa por durva. We will want to abandon samsara itself. We want to give up attachment for samsara, and we want to free ourselves from samsara, right? And this is really a key word. Dadala chakpa herbar gyurba is saying our attachment for this personal self, a real personal self, will become then herba means become weakened,
Luba?
lax. Herba.
Luba.
Herba means it will be not firm. It will become lessened. It will become then not gone, but we will loosen our attachment to the self. So one of the things is that is saying is, if meditating on relative truth will diminish our attachment to a personal self, but will not be abandoning the sense of self. In order to do that, you have to meditate on emptiness. That's the unique Madhyamika view, right? So it said, Dala Chaval Herbert Gurwe, Dön Kongdu Chuba. That's what it means, Dön Tokpa. Dön Tokpa means to come to that kind of understanding. When you develop that kind of understanding of impermanence, then the kind of
The process, right?
no the futility of pursuing samsaric pleasures, and therefore then slowly kind of pulling away from samsara and reaching the point where how can I free myself from samsara, and having a weaker sense of that there is a real personal self, and thinking all there is those five skandhas that are changing from moment to moment. When you have that kind of understanding, then you are ready to be taught emptiness. Riki, de oktu wemba ni riki, narotu ni mahino. Riki means it's proper, it is appropriate, it is then should be done, not before that. It would be inappropriate to really teach emptiness in a really powerful and deep way until the person has developed that kind of attitude towards samsara. That's a really powerful statement, right? He says, Chinchi loktu. Otherwise, he says, if you do that, lobengi tongwani tembayang jebu meber minjur, he says. If you do that, means if you teach the Four Noble Truths first, Lobengi means Nagarjuna, Tombani Tembayang Jebu Meber Mingur. Nagarjuna is saying, then when you teach emptiness, it will not be meaningless. It will not be without value. Jebu Meber Mingur, double negative. Jebu Meba means meaningless. Mingur means it won't be meaningless. It won't be a waste of time to teach emptiness to people who have gained understanding of renunciation. Loma namkyang powatang chinchilok zimbe lopartumar minguro. Then this is the disadvantage of teaching emptiness to the person who's not ready for it. Loma means disciples won't abandon it. They won't reject it. They won't say, "I couldn't be true. Emptiness couldn't be real." Or they couldn't say, "Oh, I believe that things are really empty," but then they understand emptiness to mean nothingness. And emptiness is not nothingness. And if in either case, if they reject emptiness, or if they take it to mean nihilism, then they would fall into ruin. But if they understand renunciation well first, they won't be subject to those dangers, and then they won't fall into ruin. So both of them, right? It will be meaningful to teach them, and if you do teach them, it won't have a bad effect on them. Otherwise, says, otherwise, if they don't have a proper understanding of the two truths, relative truth and ultimate truth, then their understanding, if you just teach them emptiness alone, their understanding will not be, it will not conform properly to the nature of the relationship between the two truths, and therefore they will fall into ruin. And therefore, if they just focus on the idea of emptiness, then Miguel Apão and Minusto, they won't have any incentive to avoid non-virtuous behavior. They won't have everything's empty. Non-virtue is not real. Therefore, I don't have to worry about trying to stop myself from committing non-virtue. Mikebe lochenta draw di tombo nyam du jin ching dini tomba nina din chishika. Otherwise, the person who thinks to himself, Mikebe lochen means the person who's not intelligent and who has not been properly taught about the Four Noble Truths. Draw di tombo. The whole world is empty. Therefore, if everything is empty, what's the point? What's the need? Nothing matters. There's no such thing as nirvana. There's no such thing as the hells. There's no such thing as good deeds. And therefore, therefore, they also will not have draw. Here is a zundru. Mitra means they will not develop the sense of of energy and willingness and desire to to cultivate virtuous acts. So what's the point? There's no real positive result to be gained by cultivating virtue. Therefore, and here, this is nice. It's saying that person is like Groshok Makebe Cha. The person who's taught emptiness without having properly been taught about the Four Noble Truths is like Groshok Makebe Cha, a bird that has not grown its wings. Feathers, rather. Groshok means feathers. So it means it's the bird that is, when it's first born, it doesn't even have feathers. It just has like fuzz. Then slowly starts to grow feathers, but even in the beginning, feathers, only a few feathers, not enough, still can't fly. So before it leaves the nest, it has to have enough feathers in order to be able to actually fly. Otherwise, if the bird that doesn't have its feathers fully grown falls out of the nest, it's gonna get eaten, right? Rangi Tsang means nest. Rangi Tsang Borne means if they leave the nest, Purwa Shindu and tries to fly. Purwa means to fly. Then they will meet with ruin. If they try to leave the nest before their wings are fully, or their feathers are fully formed. So that's an explanation of that entire verse. And so here it tells you the second side, right? This is the first one at the end of the verse saying, if you want to be a bodhisattva, you have to be able to contemplate the suffering that others are subject to in order to maintain your bodhicitta. If you want to practice emptiness, you have to first understand the nature of relative truth and develop a proper appreciation of the nature of samsaric existence. Otherwise, you'll misunderstand emptiness. You won't have a proper understanding of emptiness. So that's the key point I was trying to make at the very beginning of why. I noticed you said in the first you gave the heading for the first the YouTube said I forget exactly the wording, something like right view and bodhicitta. You don't remember? You look on the heading. In that class, I made some comments about saying.
Actually, yeah, that's right.
My point was that unless you have a proper understanding of the Four Noble Truths, you cannot hope to be a proficient bodhisattva, both in relation to bodhicitta and in relation to cultivating emptiness. And so it is the foundation, this suffering and impermanence, impermanence, real subtle impermanence necessary to understand suffering of conditioned existence. Suffering of conditioned existence necessary to understand the deeper meaning of the noble truth of suffering. Then from there you can develop the aspiration to free yourself, the renunciation. Once you have renunciation, then you are ready to embark on the Mahayana path. So that's the point of these verses, and that's the main reason that I wanted to read this subject matter. So I think it's a really important point that you need to not just understand the words in some sort of vague sense of that a certain claim is being made, but rather to actually reflect on what those kind of descriptions are and really appreciate the validity of that claim. And when you gain an appreciation of the validity of both of those points, I think then you're more inclined. I think it's very helpful. It will inform your efforts to pursue the Mahayana path, because it will remind you how important it is to understand suffering in order to have bodhicitta, and how important it is to understand the nature of samsaric existence in the relative true sense before you can fully comprehend the doctrine that says samsara is not self-existent. So I think for all of us, it's really a essential and really a kind of crucial understanding, and I'm still struggling myself to kind of try to really remember it and try to have that kind of be the impetus for giving me some kind of incentive to to see that time is short, and with whatever time we have, then the best thing that we can do is develop some kind of really sincere and some kind of genuine understanding of what those two elements of Mahayana Buddhism are. If you can end your life saying, I understood what bodhicitta really means. I understand really how emptiness is not negating the five skandhas and the suffering of the Four Noble Truths. They are two sides of the same coin, and it's an essential understanding to drive your spiritual efforts. Then I think you really accomplish something. And I think we understand a little bit of what the Lamrim is about. We have some idea vaguely what the Lamrim teaches. We know something about we know what are the elements of the instruction of developing bodhicitta, and we know what the 6 paramitas are, a little bit about emptiness. But there's a long way to go before we kind of absorb that doctrine in a way where we really get what it means in a more experiential way. And not only that, but that when I say in an experiential way, it is something that we can also try to cultivate in our daily life. You hear, I hear lamas, and especially when they're talking about lojong teaching, say, when you experience some kind of painful thing, then it should remind you of, how all other sentient beings also are subject to this kind of suffering, and then that should move you to, to develop, to generate thoughts that are, in keeping with bodhicitta and the fact that you're concerned for others. And those are really, those are really beautiful, instructions, and they are meant to be, followed. But you really have to have kind of, I think, you have to have sort of the main, foundation in order to be able to actually, fulfill those admonitions and fulfill those aphorisms. So anyway, that's what's in my mind for me, and that's what I'm trying to convey. So I hope I haven't beaten you over the head too much with it. So anyway,
Not at all.
we'll pass the time for today. So we'll have a call of the day. And so this is basically the last class on the second chapter, and there'll be. I fully would like to continue this class, but for the immediate future, by that I mean at least through July and the month of August, there are too many other things going on. So we'll look to maybe coming back in the fall. Right, Bali? Okay.
Rindu bele zonyi, kadar yang bakan shik sabade, lo mikmarik ki tong drowanam, nam jenge we wambo da gyurji, derma sembe tira kundu yang, Jambe yangi ze weje sunne, dembe rimba kuntan langi cho, nyene drube gyana nye jejo, rangi jijin do be langi ne, shuga ze we drang be takegi, Drowe yiki mumba se jene, Gewe demba yurin zingyuji, Demba rinjin chogi magyabam, Gyab gyanyambar gyube chodeni, Nyingje jembu yira gyabayi, Pende dende se waraje pasho, se che gyawe me juntin le, le dru jangi, janju langi rimbe gyang, hardu namgi yila petreshin, gyawe zeba rindu gyong gyurchi, Lam san dru be drinking dru che chin. Gen se ang mi gen se che mi dan mi min kun. Tera kun du gyawe na ba yi. Nam da lam dan dra wara ma gyurji. Kanze tepa chola chu chu chu, Sushin drubla zamba de yize, Gyunden namgi datu dro che ching, Chashi gyatsu chokun kya gyuru Gawadi gewokun Sonan yeshe zozo shin Sonan yeshe le jungwe Tamba bunyi tobar sho Ninjun tawa rinpoche Make panam ke gyurjik Geba nyamba membar yong Gong ne gong ju pelwara sho.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Really
So
amazing.